perhaps you don't have these criticisms, but I'm curious from an academic point of view, what criticisms would you have of someone who did work like I do? Not your criticisms necessarily, but how would a historian, academic historian, approach criticizing me?
Well, I think an academic historian might say, bring me the documents. Right? Historians like texts, right? They like things written on pieces of paper. So although there is a lively field of oral history and the technique of talking to people is perfectly reasonable, and there are all sorts of arguments about how one does that, methods and so on. And your work, very much fits into that. Historians like to see pieces of paper. So of course pieces of paper are very scarce about lots of things. And you try to find these. Perhaps they're more buried somewhere in the Israeli archives or elsewhere, but there may not be. And for many things they're not documented in that sort of way. And especially people who perpetrate these kinds of acts don't necessarily want to write it down, right? So yeah, that's something someone could raise, but it seems to me, as I said, I think Footnotes in Gaza is a work of history. It's a work of historical research. You certainly devoted an enormous amount of time and energy to talking to everybody you could and finding people and getting their perspectives. So, what one could say, yes, let's put this in a bigger framework. I mean, to turn it, I guess, into a work of academic history, whether that's a good thing or not, I don't know. And it's in no way a criticism of the genre, of the way you approached it. One then would put it in larger context, in larger questions of Israeli policy and perceptions, in what was going on in Gaza in the context of this particular war. Because again, it's not the only massacre, right? We know about Kfar Qasim, which signals there are other things going on, right? And the people who perpetrated, the Israeli border police personnel who perpetrated the massacre at Kfar Qasim were barely punished. And the word got out, it became a big issue, it became a scandal ultimately, but it didn't affect Israeli policy in any significant way towards its Palestinian minority. So putting things in those kinds of contexts, seeing how they fit into bigger pictures, might be something that would be to build on your work. It's not in place of your work. It would be perhaps building on your work and using the kinds of things you did to weave it into a work of history. But I think it stands as a monument on its own, as an enormously useful kind of thing. And you've excavated something which, again, was not part of local. I mean, it was again of individuals, absolutely, as you demonstrated, but in terms of a larger collective memory, which was clearly floating out there somewhere. Right? Everybody knew about it of a certain age, or heard about it from the grandfathers and grandmothers, but it wasn't sort of on the mental map, and now it is.
Right. I mean, one of the reasons I'm asking you this is there's a funny story. I met Noam Chomsky once, and he's kind of a hero of mine. I mean, he's one of the people whose work helped inform me about what was going on, or at least giving me some other slant on this. And when I met him, I didn't think he really knew my work or anything like that. So we were sitting down, and I explained that I do my work in comics form, and that I was working on a book about something I'd learned about through one of his books about what happened in Han Yunis and Rafah in 1956. And the first words out of his mouth were, well, how would I cite that? I thought, oh, wow. I hadn't thought of that.
It's very Chomsky-esque.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I understand. It's like that's how he works. He cites things, and that's, I think of that as being very important to a historian. And the truth of the matter is, I was really hoping I'd find some really good documentary evidence, because I know that's sort of the gold standard. But I imagine there are many historical episodes that don't have the smoking gun or their equivalent. Doesn't mean some episode didn't happen.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, this comes up with 1948 in Palestine, right? There's no piece of paper that anyone's found where David Ben-Gurion says, expel them all, right, or as many as you can manage, right? But I'm not sure we need such a thing, right? There's also no piece of paper where Adolf Hitler says, kill all the Jews, that anyone has been able to find. I'm not making an analogy directly between these two situations, obviously. They're very different. But as you say, there are lots of pieces of paper which are not there. And what is there in many cases is human beings, right? Who you can talk to and who have a memory which has to be respected and made part of the record,
right?
Even if it's not written down.
Right. And my feeling with this story, Footnotes in Gaza, was these people are older. and if I don't do this, then, or if someone doesn't do this, talk to them, then they're going to be gone, and then we're really going to be left with is that, that UN document that doesn't really clarify things. Though I've got to say, there were local historians that had worked on this, and I talked to 2 local historians that they were amateur historians. One of them, he had a lot of useful information, but then a lot of information that I certainly wouldn't touch, because I felt that doesn't sound right to me, or it's so, I don't know how to put it exactly, but it's sort of so libelous or slanderous or whatever it is that you've got to really verify it.
About the role of other people who
Well,
were there,
about
or
what Israeli soldiers had done. For example, he claimed that a guerrilla suspect, someone who was a guerrilla, according to him, had been captured by the Israelis and then pulled apart by 2 jeeps, which is it's just too hard to believe. And I think I found something that suggests something else happened to this guy. But what I'm curious about is how historians would look at Arab historians, like American historians. It seems like Israeli historians, when an Israeli historian writes revisionist history, that's always very well considered. Whereas I don't hear too much about Palestinian historians and their take on the situation.
Well, if you've talked to Benny Morris, you have one perspective on this, right?
Right.
So Benny Morris did very important work in the 1980s on the origins of the Palestinian refugee, the dispossession of the Palestinians. But if you talk to him, he has no interest whatsoever in the Arab side of things, in Arab sources, in Arab historians. He says flat out there are no Arab historians or Palestinian historians. And there, of course, he's flat wrong. There are lots of Palestinian historians, both sort of academic historians in American, European universities, and Palestinian universities in the West Bank and Gaza and within Israel proper, and people who are not academic historians but producing history of all kinds. So there's certainly lots of work out there, but because I think again the Israeli historians tend to use the Israeli materials, and that's been very rich, and because what the Palestinians of course experienced in 1948, there aren't the same kind of Palestinian archives, right? They don't have a state, or they didn't have the kind of pre-state institutions that the Zionist movement or the Jewish community in Palestine did. So it's often very difficult to find parallel kinds of things, and to the extent one can find them, they're often buried in the Israeli archives. Right? So there are all sorts of people who do research on the Palestinian national movement or aspects of Palestinian social institutional life, and the materials are in the archives of the Israeli military, acquired for intelligence purposes, or captured, or whatever it might be. So there's certainly an asymmetry which makes it very difficult. And of course, Palestinian historians, scholars generally, have worked under infinitely more adverse circumstances because they're in diaspora, because they're under occupation, again, don't have the institutions, the financing, the resources that Israelis have tended to have. So there's a continuing disproportion there in what we have, although the gap has been narrowing.